Do you need a clip?
I mean, do you need an answer to that question? Oh my God.
I did it.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to an episode without a number of the Carmudgeon Show. My name is Derek Tam-Scott, and that is Jason Space Cammisa.
Ow.
It's also
brain.
It's opposite day. And we're no longer going to say the episode number in this because of how many times we've had to hold an episode for a reason or move stuff around. And then we keep wanting to do this like dubby thing. We're like, welcome to episode number
704
of the
Hagerty Podcast Network. Carmudgeon Show. This episode is about
Jaguar?
Nope. That was last episode.
This
episode is about miscellaneous nations and the cars they produce and how each of the cars produced by that nation, or many of the cars produced by that nation, are manifestations of the culture intrinsic to that nation.
Okay, so I'm going to translate that into English for those of you who don't speak hyphen. Each of us, like our cars, all of our cars, like us, are products of our environment. So for the rest of this episode, I'm going to talk like I'm from Brooklyn, because I'm from Brooklyn.
Thank God we know in advance that's not true.
That I'm not from Brooklyn?
No.
I'll fucking kill you.
Okay, we believe you're from Brooklyn.
Okay.
We believe you're from wherever you want to be.
All you have to do is threaten to break someone's fucking legs and they believe you're from Brooklyn. But it is actually true.
And this episode, of course, has been brought to you aboard an orange truck from Reliable Carriers.
Because reliable carriers are?
They are reliable and are good at transporting podcast episodes and automobiles.
They're also good at giving you a 10% discount if you mention the Carmudgeon Show on your quote.
When obtaining your quote. So we thank them for that.
We do. And if you don't hit fast forward, we'll be right back after these messages.
What messages? You mean the song?
Yeah.
The intro
song? You can say we'll be back after this. We'll be right back after these messages. Do you remember for the cartoons?
Yeah, of course.
After these messages, we'll be right back. And we're back. Oh, Derek is taking his clothes off.
God.
Everyone look away.
Are we recording?
Yeah.
Oh, Christ on a Trisket.
Yeah, so the last episode, you took your clothes off slowly last week.
I didn't realize we were recording it. I wanted to configure before we started recording.
We can cut all this out, or we could just have Paulo put it in to embarrass you. It's entirely up to you.
Is it? It's not entirely up to me.
I mean, I can pretend that it's entirely up to you, tell you that. We've done this stupid lunch thing again.
Oh, yes. Stupid lunch. Lunch makes you stupid.
I don't actually snore, so hold on.
We do have an episode topic.
What? Sorry, dozed off there. I could use a nap, yes. Because you were just in a press car of mine. Mm-hmm. It's a Polestar. And what
Excuse me?
Swedish. So what was my line? The search for Sweden's hottest supermodel stripper. Polestar. The search for Sweden's hottest stripper. Cough. Week 8, 9. I don't even know. 42. We were in a Polestar. Mm-hmm. We were in a car with a Polestar badge on it, and there's the Derek giggle. We're gonna have like two. It's not. We were in a vehicle. We were both in the same Polestar, and I burnt my hands, and you said it was chlamydia. No, I said that. I swear, Derek, get a hold of yourself. This is very important. Very professional levels.
How did you burn your hands on a Swedish Polestar? In a Swedish Polestar, whatever. Whatever preposition. From handling.
It was very hot. It was really
too hot to handle.
Yeah, the steering wheel heater on that Polestar is nuclear hot, and I made you grab it.
And confirmed. It is nuclear hot.
Yeah, but what was your first reaction to that?
Fucking the Swedes. You need that in Sweden.
It's exactly what you said.
Got to work through mittens.
You looked at and we both said at the same time, Sweden. Yes. Which brings us to one of the topics from our Q&A that we said we were going to which was that do cars reflect where they come from? I think it's a great segue.
Yes, absolutely.
Not talking about one of those
totally
scooters.
Appropriate.
Right? Good. Aren't we good at like taking other people's ideas from our Q&A thing and pretending like we came up with these ideas on our own.
Oh, yes. This is, to be fair, something that I've thought about at length.
Is there anything you haven't thought about at length or width?
I can't even say that. Okay.
All right. So this is, I'll let you speak at length. I'm going to turn my mic off. Take a nap.
Which nation would you like to start with?
Sweden.
Of all?
I did. I started with Sweden. Hurdy-gurdy. Hurdy-hurdy. That's what they sound like, isn't
it? Is that from
You've seen
Sesame Street?
No, is it?
Yeah. Swedish Chef.
Swedish Chef.
Swedish Chef.
No, I'm thinking of actually the Catherine Tate.
Yes.
Yeah, she comes in for a job interview.
We are going to get canceled for abusing Sweden and every other
No.
country.
We're going to get everyone. Let me be there. We're going to make fun of everyone today.
Who makes a car? Oh, then we'll make fun of countries that don't make cars because they're not.
We're just going to make fun of humans, and it's going to come out of love. No, there was a Catherine Tate skit many years ago. You guys should probably look it up on YouTube. We're not going to put it in here. But I think she was a temp that she came into an office and was there, and so they panicked.
Oh, yes.
They panicked because the translator, there was an interpreter, a bunch of interpreters or something was supposed to show up for this like international meeting of executives. And she's like, well, I speak all of those languages. And so they sit down at the table and the guy's like, hello, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And she's just kind of nodding and looks all professional. And then she then has to repeat what he says in all of the different languages of the people there. And it was just like the French guy. And she just, and she's just
unhinged.
And then they tell him, die, bobbity boobity. And the Swedish, she just looked at I think it was a lady, and was like, hurdy-gurdy, 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 hurdy-gurdy. Anyway, so I am not, in fact, making fun of the Swedish language. I'm embracing the love of comedians who made fun of the Swedish language.
Okay.
Okay, Swedish cars. What do they do well?
Function in snow.
Yeah, primary requirement. So Sweden, I just learned this firsthand from a resident of the Swedish country. Have a huge American, but we know this, right? We've heard this before, a huge classic American car culture in Sweden. And the reason that I was just given was that Swedish roads very much resemble rural American roads. Lots of big, long distances, slow speeds.
Slow speeds?
Relatively slow speeds. I mean,
slow by German standards, not slow by American standards.
I don't know. I haven't spent any time in Sweden on the roads. I can't imagine they're, 160 kilometers. They're not autostradas or autobahnen. So yeah, what do the cars have to do? Function in the snow, which is what one of the, the Saab things was, it was great in snow, even though that was disproven by Car and Driver.
Was it?
Yeah, front-wheel drive cars aren't actually that much better in the snow.
Really?
They're easier to handle.
So that's better.
Yeah.
Less lethal, less pirouetting.
Depends. If you have a Saab, you have all kinds of airbags and crumple zones. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, you want to avoid, the best way to survive an accident is to not have the accident in the first place.
Which is to not pirouette off into the scenery.
Yep. But front-wheel drive
supposedly
cars,
pretty good at hitting moose also.
They're good at hitting the moose or good at protecting the passengers when you do hit a moose?
Isn't that the same thing?
Isn't that Polestar? Something? What? Anyway, we're back. I'm telling you, we got to stop this lunch before recording.
I would expire one way or another. I would just
Which would still be more interesting than this conversation so far. Sorry. I apologize profusely to anyone who doesn't want to see Derek expire live on the Carmudgeon Show.
And who has to listen to this godforsaken episode.
Trust me, we're getting to a point here.
Okay.
It might happen in the next episode, but at some point, a point will have been made. We're
approaching the point.
Cars reflected. So the things that are important to Swedes are snow performance and so they have great heaters, right?
Okay.
You compare and contrast that with, let's back up. I think the best example of cars that are a product of where they come from is German cars.
Yes.
Versus American cars. I think that's the biggest probably gulf that you'd have. So I never owned an American car until my van. But grew up not being an aficionado of American cars and not appreciating American cars. There are certainly ones that I want to own, certainly cars that I think are cool. So no offense to anyone who likes American cars. But they are very much a reflection of what the roads were like and the economic conditions were like in Detroit in their time. So 1980s, 1970s American cars, before they were really heavily influenced by European cars, were big, cheap, and floaty.
Mm-hmm. And that is a great American tradition.
Big and cheap, just like me.
Mm-hmm.
Floaty also, if you put me in salt water.
Okay.
So, yeah, I didn't understand American cars at all. I genuinely thought American car company executives must be stupid to have missed this opportunity to make, for many decades, to make cars that were competitive with European cars. That was because I grew up in New York, in Westchester, which was right north of the city, which is hilly, mountainous, relatively small, compact roads, and everything was twisty. Plus, people tended to be a little bit more international and
than Detroit
and well off than I think most of the people in the Midwest. And so a subcompact car like a 3 Series or a Saab 900 or really anything made far more sense than a big American floaty boat that couldn't go around a corner or couldn't get up our hill. For example, all the big American rear-wheel drive stuff would be
in the
littered,
snow.
Yeah, at the bottom of the hill in the snow. And so even when E30s would make it up, I mean, that was like the hierarchy. Like, you know, an old Delta 88 would be the first one to get stuck, and then all the E30s would get stuck. And then, you know, the Saabs would go right. My mom had a Saab, go right up the hill. My dad had a Land Cruiser, and that was a big car when it really actually wasn't big when you compare it to the American stuff. Mm-hmm. You go to Detroit, it was the most, I moved there at 31 years old, and it was the 31. It was the most eye-opening experience. I hated my cars. I moved there with a 911, with my Scirocco, with a Cosworth Mercedes, and my E30. I think that was it. And all of a sudden, that short gearing that I loved so much in the Volkswagens was, and the Mercedes was even worse, really annoying. Going to the grocery store, I was holding up traffic because I couldn't go faster than 50 miles an hour in top gear because the engine was spinning too fast. You know, meanwhile, there's American barges going by at 80 miles an hour at 1,200 RPM, blip, 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 blip. And I'm 4,000 at 70 in the right lane going, I'm sorry, I'm blocking traffic. Really taught me that the cars were very much a product of...
Yes, but what you just described, it would not be so good on the Autobahn.
Well, they didn't hold up. I mean, which described the American
Your
stuff?
Mercedes would have been not suited to Autobahn use.
But it was. It was geared for top speed. So, you know, I have to explain, I find that I have to explain this a lot. When I say cars are geared for top speed, what happens is
the power curve lives somewhere where you can be happily accelerating from 100 to 125 miles an hour.
It's not even that so much because you can always drop down a gear to accelerate. But if you think that, you know, the engine's power curve is not a constant thing, right? So typically the faster you go engine speed, the more power you make to a point. That's the power peak, and then it drops off. In the case of that 190, for example, power peak is 6,200 RPM. Is where it occurs, and that's 185 horsepower. If you very carefully, very simply calculate out the theoretical maximum speed of that 190 E2.316 using 185 horsepower to push it, you'll get to, don't ask me how I know this, 140, I think it was 145 miles an hour, right? That's the theoretical max. So you would gear that car to have
Fifth gear at 6,200 RPM corresponds to 145 miles an hour.
And guess what? Car's actual top speed, 143 miles an hour at 6,250 or something, right there. But what that means is if the car's doing 143 miles an hour at 6,200, at 31, it's doing half of that, right? In that case, in the Euro 2316, that means it's 3,000. The US car, they didn't have to deal with that. Hold on, that's not true. They did have to deal with it. The car had 164 horsepower instead of 185, and so it brought down the top speed considerably. And so they chose a fifth gear where the top speed would line up with its theoretical, and that meant even shorter gears. And so that's why, you know, cars are screaming on the Autobahn. Germans don't care. It needs to hit its theoretical max, and the only way to do that is have a gear where the power peak lines up, and that's going to be top gear. So that's what's important to Germany. That's irrelevant.
Used to be top gear.
When you only had 5 to choose from.
Correct.
And you needed
Once
to maximize.
Once you got 6 speeds, then sometimes people would make top speed occur in fifth gear.
And then a 6 being a cruising gear, just a lower RPM and get better. And as cars have gotten faster and faster and they're limited, so, you know, if a car's native top speed is 320 kilometers an hour, but it's only limited to 250, well, then at that point, it doesn't matter. Give it a couple cruising gears. So, but that's a thing that we would never have in the U.S. The U.S. is more concerned with comfortable long-distance cruising that's relatively economical at 60, 70, 80 miles an hour, and that's it.
Right, yes. and good overtaking ability. I mean, so these are manifestations of technical differences that appear in, I don't know, how you interact with the car. I think a lot of the differences, I studied this at length. I have even talked about this before on the podcast. About, for example, if you talk about tanks in World War II and the American approach versus the German approach. The American approach was about field expediency and fixing stuff. You can't send it back to the factory if you're in war in Europe. Can't go back across the Atlantic. And the German approach was everything was so beautifully engineered and made to such high standards because the Germans could not imagine, they could not countenance making anything but that. And so if they needed repairs, they'd have to send them back to the factory, and then they'd have to railroad them back, and the trains would get bombed on the way, or the factories would be getting bombed.
But there was some German with a spreadsheet going, "What's this is still more efficient."
It is the way it must be done. Yeah. And so the Americans are out there fixing stuff with duct tape, and the Germans are trying to send stuff back to the factory, and it's not working so well in the field. And so you get this really different philosophy about how, like, the role of engineering. Engineering is a religion, effectively, in Germany. Mm-hmm. You see this in museums. I mean, to me, it is so cool. And if you've not been to Germany and you are an enthusiast, you should do this and just go to the museums, because they take technical museums incredibly seriously. We have Disneyland. They have, like, the ZF Museum. The ZF Museum is a real thing, and you can go, and I'd recommend it. But also, like, the one in Berlin is really good, the Sinsheim Technik Museum. I mean, there is, and the thing about these museums also is that they're clearly oriented towards children. They're trying to teach children, like, this is how you engineer things as a child. Like, that's how it is indoctrinated into the children from the outset. And it is treated as, like, an ultimate goal. And the quality of engineering is treated as an ultimate goal. It is an uncompromised thing that you must always do things like this. And I don't see that in the United States. We're about fast and cheap and marketing and splash and all of that stuff. And so you end up with, German tanks during World War II and American tanks during World War II. I mean, which one was better for waging war in mud? The American way actually looks kind of clever, doesn't it?
Well, it permeates every part of society, right? Germany has that engineering philosophy everywhere. And does it hurt them? I don't think so. I don't think there's a right or wrong here. And I think that's really important.
I mean, it depends on the use case. I think the case of trying to wage war in mud when stuff's getting blown up around you, the German way is maybe not that helpful.
Right.
The American way, where you can fix it with a hammer and some duct tape, is what you want in that environment.
Right, but not if you appreciate the art of engineering in and of itself.
Yes,
right. That's
correct.
There's an appreciation for that.
It is something you couldn't imagine doing.
Right.
It's like the idea of preventative maintenance in subsistence countries. The idea that you would spend money to maintain something that's not actively broken in a place where you are hand to mouth in terms of food is totally foreign. You say, well, it's not currently broken and I need to eat right now, so I'm going to do that instead of doing preventative maintenance.
This is why I don't do preventative maintenance on my cars. I'm too busy spending. I've spent all my money fixing the ones that are broken. I don't have money left for an oil change. Don't be ridiculous.
That's complete nonsense, and you know it.
I don't do all that much preventative maintenance.
Okay.
I'm cheap. I don't like throwing stuff out.
Including used motor oil?
I mean, I will throw out used motor oil, but I'm not doing it every 3,000 miles just because somebody tells me, oh, you should. I will send it out to the lab and I'll be German about it. I will send it to
follow the data.
Exactly. I will follow the data and do it. But who's to say culturally, I want to make it very clear, there is no right versus wrong, right? This is just different ways of doing things. And those cultural differences extend obviously to the way a typical Detroit car handled versus a German car. Detroit doesn't have curves.
Right.
Like, this was fascinating. No hills and no curves, but they do have terrible road quality. So what was important was huge amounts of suspension travel and willingness to use it. Long wheelbases and cars that can cruise at 50 or 60 miles an hour between the 1 mile blocks in Detroit. So you'd have these big fat cat cruisers that just kind of wallowed their way down the road, and they're amazing in Detroit. They're terrible in San Francisco on the Autobahn, right? I mean, they're not really appropriate.
I always talk about this one because I think it is such a clear illustration of the Mercedes 600 versus a Cadillac from the same era. I mean, the Mercedes 600 has air suspension and overhead cams and fuel injection and hydraulic this and all that stuff, independent suspension, disc brakes all around. And the Cadillac is live rear end, drum brakes, cam and block, carbureted. They are supposed to be the pinnacle of each country's, or basically what is the finest American car, luxury car in 1965. It's a Cadillac, and
which had
Mercedes.
a 500 cubic inch, 8.4 liter V8 in it that got 3 miles per gallon, and that was not relevant because gas was plentiful and cheap. Where in Europe you had, those well-heeled customers.
The 6.3 doesn't get great fuel economy.
Fair enough, but I mean the sort of typical car of the era in America when we had big boats that got a lot of
Volkswagen
was a VW or a Fiat Cinquecento or something that used a tiny little bit of a gas, and then was also small because the roads were small and it was easy to park.
Yes, especially urban environments, small urban environments.
I love the
non-stall parking.
Yeah, I love the whole idea of pictograms too. That's another one. You start out in St. Louis. It's sort of the middle of America, and you drive 1,000 miles in every direction, and your language doesn't change. You start out in Munich, and you drive
1,000 miles south.
You don't even have to make it
you're
that
in the Mediterranean,
far, right? You're swimming, but you could actually be in Egypt at that point. But the point is, you go a couple minutes in any direction, and the language could change dramatically. And so when you have a market that small for each one of those languages, you just say, "Well, I'll do pictograms instead of having ByLev on an HVAC controver," which to this day no one knows what that means.
Correct.
I mean,
the problem though, and this is. I've mentioned the Popular Mechanics article before from 1981 where they describe the new universalized pictograms that are being used in global cars. But up until that point, pictograms were not universalized. And so you look at these symbols and you're like, why is there bacon coming out of a toaster? Like, what does that symbol mean in a car? Because the Italians would label things differently from the British. But
who had a bacon toaster one?
I don't know. It's like a heater vent that has hot air coming out of it. It looks like bacon.
Bacon from it.
Or whatever.
The duck button that we have now these days. You know about the duck button, right?
Button?
Yeah.
Oh, no. What is it?
Yeah, there's a duck button. So many cars have duck buttons.
What does it mean?
I'm really surprised. I guess you're not into modern cars. Hill descent control. If you squint, it looks like a duck.
It does?
Yeah. I have a friend who worked at a BMW dealership, and people constantly coming in and asking him what the duck button was. And that's a standardized thing. But I'm being silly.
But so every car company would use different symbols. Right. And so you just, the Fiat conventions would be different from the Mercedes conventions would be different from, all of them. Sometimes you look at it and you're like, that seems to be a fan. Other times you're like, it's toast. I don't know. It's a sandwich.
Which could have been a sandwich maker in one of these cars. You don't know. That would come from a culture of people who are very hungry.
Panini.
Yeah.
Yes, the German philosophy is quite different. And we've talked about tax horsepower and the way that impacted British cars. That is a response directly to reducing road taxes. Italy also,
So are all the small displacement high RPM engines that came out of Europe, all of them?
Yes, yes, because volumetric efficiency is favored by that. And so your horsepower per liter.
Yes.
Right. So what you would say is if we're taxed on displacement, we want to get maximum power from that displacement. And so you need volumetric efficiency, which means it needs to be high revving.
No, you need volumetric efficiency as torque, I think. Specific volumetric efficiency per rev. Rev dependent. You need revs. Volumetric efficiency translates to torque. Torque times revs equals power. Yes. The point is they backed into it. You need 50 horsepower to be able to move this car reasonably, and you only have 2 liters. Well, then you're going to have X amount of revs to do so. And that's what they did.
That's why Italian cars tend to have these sort of dramatic high revving engines because there was a really strong incentive there. And this still exists in a different format, but it used to be that 2 liters and above, regardless of natural aspiration or whatever, was really strongly disincentivized by the tax structure there. And so you have all these like sort of premium cars with 2 liter, slightly under 2, like 1997 cc's, to the point that it was a thing for Ferraris. You had the Ferrari 208 and then 308s everywhere else. And then they made turbocharged ones. And this happened with the Alfa 164, for example. You could get here, you had a 3 liter V6, and there it was a 2 liter turbo V6 with the same horsepower. And they had, in addition to the 4 cylinders.
And the benefit of that is it could be increasingly Italian, meaning it would brake more.
Yes, by adding complexity in the form of turbocharging and probably insufficient cooling for the turbo bearings and all that good stuff. And now that they realized that I guess horsepower was the way to go. And so now you have the Bolo and Super Bolo in Italy, which is like this draconian thing where I think if you have, it's like 20 euros or is it 100 euros per horsepower or something? Beyond, once you pass a certain threshold, it's some number of euros per horsepower. And it equates to, for example, an Alfa Romeo Giulia Quadrifoglio is like 5,000 euros a year to register.
Yikes.
Because it has so much, there's two thresholds. There's one that's like somewhere between 150 and 200, and then there's another one that I think is 250 horsepower. And then when you pass 250 horsepower, it's some number of euros per horsepower. And so like cars like Giulia Quadrifoglios have no resale value there because they're so expensive to register.
That's so crazy.
And so people will, it incentivizes them to leave the country, or you just have to be fabulously wealthy.
Shouldn't it be like the rest of Europe where it's just CO2? I mean, I think that's, at the end of the day, I think that's probably the best way to do it. If you can have a 1,000 horsepower car that's quite efficient for whatever reason, great.
Well, yes.
What we really care about is emissions.
Yes, and that already happened once when they switched from displacement, because they just in the past assumed that displacement directly mapped to
fuel economy,
fuel consumption. Yeah. And then they were like, it's actually horsepower. And now it's like, yes, carbon emissions would be the thing.
The Italian 2-liter cap created some pretty cool motors. I mean, you mentioned Ferrari 208, and that was, for the record, a 2-liter version of the 308 V8. So it's a 2-liter V8, occasionally with a turbo, like you said, but also BMW's S14 B20.
Yes, the 2-liter version of the M3 engine.
Right, which is apparently, according to Jost Capito and what's his name? He's in jail. Wolfgang Hatz, the two guys who did the engine, they both agreed the 2-liter was better than the 2.3, which was better than the 2.5. So like, take your Sport Evo E30 M3 and fuck off, because the Italian market 320i
IS
actually made the same horsepower as the 2.3, made more, he said, but they couldn't advertise it as such. So they lied. Yeah. But that's, sweetheart of a motor.
Smoother, which is not a high bar, because most motors are smoother than those 2.3s and 2.5s. I've never driven a 2.5, but my assumption is it's not smoother than a 2.3.
It is not smoother than 2.3. They are motorsport inspired. We'll call it that. I mean, they're great when you're wringing their necks, but they're just not wonderful to live with. But I love that. I mean, I love that you have a market that even, like Italy, which is a fairly small market, had enough of a market, enough people who wanted to spend money on real cars, but didn't want to waste on taxes.
Yeah, just the idea of a 2-liter Ferrari or 2-liter Maserati, which they also did.
I mean, have you ever driven a 208?
No, I've not.
I would love to. I think it would. So my 308 GT4 is a 6.2 to 60, 6.1, somewhere in that area. It's pretty quick. I mean, it's dead even with an ND1 Miata. From 0 to 80 miles an hour. It's a quick car. I would love to see what that would be like as a 10 or 11 second car, which is what the 2-liters were.
I think they were like 8.5, 9.
Okay, well then we've driven one, because the U.S. cars with cats were so fucking slow that they were.
Yeah, but it's like a low compression, like garbage cam timing motor that will have a sort of like flat characterless torque favoring, as opposed to like a...
I love underpowered. I mean, obviously I have the Beat, right? I love cars that scream while they're keeping up with traffic. A perfect example, Lamborghini LM02. You've driven them, yes?
No, never.
Imagine a Countach with a dogleg 5-speed that can barely keep up with traffic.
Okay, that part's not Countach.
Matted. I mean, these things, 7,700 pounds, some 72 or 77, I don't remember. They're very, very heavy, and just fairly... I don't remember it being long-legged. I think it was pretty short-geared, and just shifters over here in the next county, and you just foot on the floor keeping up with traffic in a quad cam V12. It doesn't really
with 6 carburetors.
Yeah, making all kinds of noise. Cool stuff.
I'm interested in that experience. That sounds pretty great.
And yes, it is. You should have that experience. I'm very annoyed that you haven't had that experience. I wanted to talk to you about that. But because I thought that would be a great segue into Lamborghini versus Ferrari, because these are very different car companies with very different products. And I think they really are a result of where they come from. So you go to Ferrari, you go to Maranello, and they're at the base of mountain roads. They're squiggly, twisty roads. And the test drivers go up in those roads all the time. You see the test cars, and they are hauling ass. Would be an insult to anyone who's ever killed themselves on a back road hauling ass. They're insane.
Yes.
Very, very, very good drivers. And the roads are bumpy and they're twisty. And there's a lot of elevation change. So there are jumps and other stuff. By contrast, you go to Lamborghini.
Everything's just a bunch of farm roads that are flat and covered in tractors.
Yeah. And so you wind up
threading the needle through oncoming traffic.
Yep. So the cars need to be, they can be wide, which Ferraris can't because of those roads. They're long-legged, which Ferraris weren't. They would brutalize the road because the roads are fairly smooth versus the Ferrari stuff, which is sort of delicate over it. And Lamborghini stuff didn't handle historically. I mean, you're probably going to yell at me, so I'm going to back slowly away from the table.
No, I don't.
Okay.
I mean, I think the Miura handles pretty nicely.
But in a very different way from period Ferraris, right? It will, despite the bumps and despite everything else, it will be okay where Ferraris enjoy them.
Yeah.
I think the Miura is probably the exception.
Yeah, the Miura is really exceptional to that. Countach, I definitely agree.
Yeah.
I
mean, it's not that they don't grip. It's just that they beat the shit out of you on those roads.
Really depends on the setup, too. I mean, if it's a low-profile Countach or the 14-inch wheeled cars with XWXs, then those are actually not bad.
Mm-hmm. But even I just drove a Murcielago LP640 6-speed. Thought I was going to hate it. I mean, I put 1,000 miles on a Mercy years ago, and it was a paddle shift car. It was okay. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say. What a fucking experience, right? Great experience.
Old school supercar.
Yeah. But this LP640 was magic. Oh my God.
Like $1 million.
Okay. Well, fine. I can't have one, but the whole thing from start to finish was magic. But you get in, you're really shocked at how wide these cars are, and they're just big, and they would just never fit on Maranello roads.
Yeah,
I found
they're
that
really
so
beefy and imposing, and I mean, it's everything comes second to making an impact in that car.
A visual and acoustic impact. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
not a road
yeah.
impact.
Now that car is surprisingly good. Light, unbelievably light shifter, unbelievably light clutch, absolute perfect clutch, throttle calibration. The engine was tractable. Only thing it did wrong was it hit the rev limiter at an indicated 8100 instead of the red line of 8500. It's probably just tack error. That's it. But it turned. It didn't understeer terribly. My God, it was so good.
Okay.
Anyway.
Well, now you need one of those. One needs one
Anyone
of those.
have a spare $1 million? Hey, I'll sell that Hyundai for
$1 million.
$1 million.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. What other Italian cars are quintessentially Italian and representing the cultural philosophy? And what are the characteristics that you would... So we've talked about high revving engines, and that is a reflection perhaps of the 2-liter thing.
The cars themselves are tiny.
Yes, physical dimensions,
Yep.
which is generally true in Europe. I think, let's see, anything else to discuss regarding Italian cars before
Passionate.
Yes.
These are passionate
And that is a reflection
people.
of culture
Mm-hmm.
and a general public enthusiasm for motorsports or driving.
Weren't we just when we were in Europe, didn't we? Was it the F40 that went by and the old lady was like, wow, or whatever?
Yeah.
It was some very loud car that was, screaming through town. And,
And the old ladies, instead of being like, "Arr," they're like,
La macchina.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
this is a culture that reveres in making noise
right.
and
I mean,
celebrating.
if you talk about like what is the most recognized and iconic Italian brand globally, it's probably Ferrari.
Would have to be.
I can't think of anything that would be obviously among non-car people.
Barilla pasta. They all call themselves Italy's number one pasta. The blue boxes and the. Yeah, no, it'd have to be Ferrari. But I don't think we as Americans, I think if you don't go to Italy, you don't really understand that this is
How
you will
universal and widespread
Yeah.
enthusiasm for cars is.
literally have old ladies screaming in joy
Yes.
at you going through town at 8,000 RPM, blowing fireballs out the exhaust on the upshifts.
Yeah.
Where here, that's just, there's no way.
Yeah, no. I mean, it would be a lot of carnage. And
Carnage.
carnage.
At first, I thought you said carnage. And then I was like, wait, he actually said carnage.
Yes.
Caranosity?
Sure.
Caranosity. Anyway.
And so, yeah, it is embedded in the Italian culture, more or less, to be enthusiastic about sort of emotive. And you see this not just in cars. I mean, Italian design when it comes to furniture or suits, like anything that they make generally, they're going to try and make it be some kind of aesthetic experience.
True.
And the cars certainly reflect that. Even shitboxes, stuff like Fiat Ritmos and,
There's a style. They all have a style to them.
right.
Always. Is this why the French chose so many diesels? Because they all smoke? And they want their car to smoke also?
That's probably motivated by tax or fuel consumption or gas
For sure,
tax.
I'm joking. France is another huge manufacturer of automobiles that we don't see here at all.
At all anymore. Yeah.
But the French cars, you can go as the owner of a French car that is currently being transported to San Francisco.
Is that true?
You can tell us all about what makes French cars French.
I would say there are 3 quintessentially French characteristics in a car. What? Let me see. What are yours?
No,
I've
asked you.
Okay,
I do for sure. Everyone knows the first one.
Weirdness.
No.
Oh.
Like I said, there's no wrong answers here. We're being nice to everyone. Weird is a value judgment.
Soft suspension and a lot of body roll.
Okay.
Incredibly soft and squishy seats.
Oui.
And usually kind of lame motors.
Okay. I definitely, so the first thing my mind goes to is obviously the ride. Right?
Yes.
The whole idea of a sporty ride being stiff to French car culture is stupid.
It's just mutually exclusive.
It must have come, the mental image goes to the original commercials for the Deux Chevaux where there's a basket of eggs in the. You've probably seen. You were probably there when they made that commercial.
I was actually the driver. Right. So one of the criteria for the Deux Chevaux, and like every country, of course, we've talked about this, has a car that mobilized it. Ford Model T, Fiat Cinquecento, or the original Topolino, really. Deux Chevaux, Volkswagen, Austin 7, later the Mini.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Maybe there's no such thing in Sweden. They were probably just importing Volkswagens.
I would say so. I don't think the Saab 92 did it.
No, I don't
Quite
think it mobilized the whole country.
Yeah.
Although it has that kind of vibe, but it's too clever. So the Deux Chevaux, was competing with donkey carts effectively. Mm-hmm. So the lore goes, and so it had to have a really soft ride because they were going to be purchased by farmers who would be driving them across unimproved surfaces that weren't necessarily roads like their fields. And so it had to transport a basket of eggs without breaking any over an unplowed field. And that was supposedly one of the design criteria for that car. And apparently that cultural sort of touchstone propagated across all French automobiledom. I haven't driven that many new French cars. So I don't know if this
I'm
is
not sure
true.
that there's much left of the whole idea of the original French cars, right? But you would go.
There's certainly some eccentricity. You look like a Citroën Cactus or whatever, and you're just like, why does it have some of the little lumpies on the doors are green and others are gray? Like, why are there lumpies on the door at all? Like,
because I like it that way.
Because it is more interesting than a shitbox.
Right. Shitbox German car. I mean, you talk about the Deux Chevaux, and we don't know whether that was actually an engineering requirement, but it's certainly part of the lore. One of the engineering requirements of the Volkswagen Beetle was, of course, because Germany, speed record, right? The extended high-speed cruising. The car had to be able to cruise at 100 kilometers an hour for its entire life.
Yeah.
So,
because the Autobahn just been invented.
Exactly. Well, France didn't have Autobahns. France had shitty back roads. And so the cars needed to be able to transport people without jiggling their eggs apart.
Yes.
Really
Spallottare is the verb in Italian.
What the what?
Spallottare.
Spallottare?
Spallottare.
Spallo.
Spallottare.
Okay, which means?
Like jostle about. Anyway.
To jostle one's eggs as opposed to one's own eggs. That'd be different.
So apparently this ended up in virtually every French car, at least all of the iconic ones. I don't know if this is still the case. I don't have enough modern French car experience to know if there's any French cars left that ride like this.
Well, non plus. I mean, you still hear European reviewers talk about French ride quality and so forth.
Do they?
Yeah, but I don't think it's to the extent that it was. I think all cars have sort of met
now
in
it's
the middle anyway.
In those old cars, it was like
huge,
unreal. It was like you were at risk of capsizing. It seemed. I mean, the Citroëns, of course, are famous for this.
Capsize all the time.
The DSs and SMs and CX and all of those cars have like just an unreal. And I think the seats are a reflection of that too. That is my first impression of the 405 when I bought it. When it came off the truck and I sat in it and I was like, this is the softest automotive seat I have ever touched, like by an order of magnitude.
That's another That's
And
another
Citroens are
Swedish
like this
thing.
too.
Swedish cars are this way too, and I think it's mostly
Soft seats?
Volvo. Volvo has the most amazingly comfortable seats. Yeah,
Comfortable, not soft. Like
fair enough.
in the Peugeot,
Okay.
they are
were
soft to
for
the point
sake
of being like disarming, like disorienting.
Is
You're
it
just
broken?
Like, yeah, like is it? Am I smooshing everything in here? The Tesla Model 3 seats are actually quite soft and cloud-like that also.
More so than I think most modern seats. Yeah.
Yes.
Certainly for seats for any of the German stuff. Because
yes,
hard
everyone,
seats are
Americans
German.
would always complain about how hard German seats were.
Yeah.
You read this when you read the first article about the 450 SL 6.9, and they're like, it's so austere in here for a $50,000 car, however much the car cost. And the seats are kind of hard, and the wood is very rectilinear. It's like premium, but it's so straight liney that it's like not premium because it's so just efficient.
Matter of fact.
Ruthlessly efficient.
Yeah. And then you do 150 miles an hour for 2 hours
That's
straight. And
luxury.
you're like, yeah, that's luxury. The German way. The interesting one to me, I don't know enough about Japanese geography, is do Japanese cars really reflect?
I mean, physical dimensions, of course.
In Tokyo, right? In the big cities.
It's quite a mountainous country. There's a lot of earthquakes and volcanoes, geologically speaking, which created the nation, and so it is very mountainous.
I guess the whole thing is really the K-car phenomenon that exists. That's the big cultural, the biggest cultural difference. But I think the rest of Japanese automakers sort of came in the second wave of the automotive industry, where they've taken on the qualities of the nations where they are selling their cars.
Well, yes, and that's a very good characteristic to have. I mean, this is what made Honda so revolutionary with Marysville, Ohio in 1983 or whatever it was, that the American perception of Japanese cars, of imported cars in the 1970s and into the 80s was just, they were like, this makes no sense for here. You know, if you read the contemporary reviews, they're like, this makes sense if you're a commuter and you just need a device to go places, but like, why is it so expensive? You could get a bigger car for not much more money. And like, the math didn't really pencil for them, and they didn't really care about, fuel efficiency or any of the sort of attributes or that Japanese cars represented. And eventually Honda was like, we have to make a car that's more suited to American tastes, which was a very sort of, I think it's anthropological to sort of be thinking about problems in this way, where it's like different consumers, different markets, different mindsets, different values, and to create products that are tailored to those. And that's why, Honda Accord was best-selling car in the USA. Camry. Is now. Yeah. I mean, they have... Which
is amazing, because when you look back at Toyota's start in the US, it was very, very not good.
Well, yeah, they had like a bunch of small shit boxes in the 50s.
The original Toyopets, I couldn't find, I talked about this in one of the videos in 2000 GT Revelations, and I couldn't find primary source information about it, but it's all sort of over history books that Toyota staged a bunch of reliability runs for the Toyopet when they first introduced it in the US, and it failed all of them. Like the one car they did, they were driving it across the country to prove that a Toyota could do it, and it didn't make it. It made it from LA to Vegas and blew up. And then they did a bunch of runs from LA to San Francisco, and one of the cars exploded, and the other one it needed to be repaired, and then finally did make it back under its own power, because it was supposed to go LA, San Francisco, and back. It was a disastrous start, and it was because those cars were engineered for a country whose geography didn't match the U.S. They didn't have the temperatures that we have in the big expansive spaces.
Right, and so it doesn't have the thermal rejection ability. And you see this like even in air conditioning systems, right? Yeah. American cars have incredibly good air conditioning systems because vast portions of this country are
very warm,
unsuited to human habitation for large portions of the year because they're so damn hot.
Right.
And so Americans got really good at air conditioning in the 1950s. And you go drive a continental European car from, 20 years newer than that, and the air conditioning is like being coughed on by a mouse through a straw with asthma. I think that's from somewhere.
Yeah, I've probably heard that before. But your point is valid, right? And so the amazing thing about the Japanese car industry is that they adapted. They tailored their products specifically for the U.S. market.
Right, which is so different from, I think, a lot of European ways of doing things. I mean, this is perhaps why the French left the American car market altogether.
Peugeot really thought the 405 was the car that was going to save Peugeot in America. I mean, this is a subcompact front-wheel drive, sports sedan-ish.
It's a very good car.
Very
and it
good
won
car.
like car of the
European
year
car of the year.
in Europe, and it is a genuinely good car, but it is not.
You are not going to reinvent the U.S. car market with a subcompact front-wheel drive sedan in 1987, 98,
the
88.
formula is not that different from the best-selling American car in the at that time, which probably would have been the Accord.
Oh, when you say American car, I'm like Chevy Cavalier.
Sorry. So this was the transition when the Japanese took over best-selling car in the United States, and then kind of never, the Americans have not, Ford Taurus probably at some point. But I think Honda was, the Accord was the best-selling car in America right around 1990. And so by that measure, the
405 wasn't that far
405 wasn't that far off the mark.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
For American preferences. And, obviously a Camry has had like a 900-year reign.
I mean,
but yeah, like
Cavalier. Camry took over in 92 when it went from a compact to a full-size car. That was the big difference.
Americans want the size.
Well, and what Toyota what Toyota and Honda both did, and Nissan, was concentrate on reliability. Hey, our reputation is cheap and chintzy, so we're going to get this so well sorted that it's never called into question again. And then we're going to make products that appeal to the market, where the Germans never did. I mean, we tend to talk the most about the German cars of any nationality, but the reality is the success story in this country is the Japanese stuff.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
They're the ones that took over and killed off vast portions of the American car industry.
I mean, Oldsmobile Cutlass was forever the best-selling American car. And it's just completely gone.
Do you want to call Oldsmobile for a comment on that?
Oh.
How about Pontiac? How about Plymouth? I mean, the list of brands that have gone Saturn.
That was bloat also. Like, when I go back and consume media in period about when they're talking about like J-Car, and you're like, why are there 74 different versions of J-Car? And like, how are they rationalizing? Journalists are being like, oh, well, this is very appropriate for Oldsmobile because X. And it's like, none of it seems different, and it all seems the fucking same, and it's all the same car. And like, are consumers really into this? And why is it worth?
They were. That was the problem.
Well, that's why they're all gone. Yes.
Right. Consumers had been brainwashed to thinking that Pontiac was a sporty one and Oldsmobile. I mean, I think I've mentioned this before. I had a fight with a friend of mine when I lived in Pittsburgh because she was adamant that her Grand Am was a completely different car than a Skylark or whatever the hell it was. Its pairing was. And, she's like, from start to finish, it's wide track, it's this, it's that, and the other thing. And I actually showed her that the Buick had a wider track than the Pontiac did. And she was like, the brakes feel totally different. And I looked up every part of the braking system, and they were literally identical. There was not a single part difference from the pedal to the master to the brake lines to the calipers to the pads to the rotors to anything else. This is a public that had been brainwashed by marketing. Okay, I say that in a bad sense, but they had been taught by marketing that these cars had real differentiators that weren't necessarily there, but the image was. And so why wouldn't GM capitalize on the fact that, she was a Pontiac girl through and through and wouldn't even consider an Oldsmobile, and Buicks were fucking old people and blah, blah, blah. Same car. Yeah. So it worked.
Yeah. But I mean, to a point.
Well, I mean, for a long time. Yeah.
To a point which we have passed.
We still have badge engineered cars, right?
That's true. And sometimes they do have meaningful differences. I think that the Type 4 platform, which we've discussed before, is a really good example of the Saab 9000. They really substantially re-engineered that car compared to other cars. I mean, that was one where they really brought, I think, the national differences between the cars and to the fore. And that's the European way of badge engineering, where you're like, yeah, it's got different engines and different this, and this. And like, I guess the chassis is shared, but everything else is different.
Parts of it, right? Because weren't the crash performance of the Fiat and the Lancia were not good enough for Saab? Is that how that happened?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's the Saab is separate, and then there's the three other ones that were all like the base level of the Type 4 platform. And then Saab's like, we have to redo all of this for us to use it.
Right. And I mean, I guess the contemporary to that time would be GM doing the same thing, right? Really, there weren't all that many differences between those three other ones, right? So it was
Chroma,
Fiat Chroma,
Tema,
Lancia Tema,
164,
Alpha 164. You should just have the list you just did. But today what we have is cars that aren't even the same company that they say they are, or from the same continent.
Oh yes, you're talking about BMW,
BMW
and
stuff.
Fiat.
Fiat, and then you also have the Subaru stuff that's now Toyota, the electric stuff. They're all trading stuff back and forth.
Yes, and part of this is just an ongoing form of consolidation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It is so expensive to bring whatever to market that now these companies that all used to merge within countries because they were so, I don't know, patriotic, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's international sort of collaborations, which the likes of which had been unthinkable before the 1980s.
I keep looking up the amount of brands that are under Stellantis.
I know Peugeot is part of it.
Crazy.
Citroën is part of it. Opel.
So you have Germany, you have France, you have Italy, you have America. You have every.
Yeah, they're all, and you had the Nissan Renault thing.
That's right.
And it's just
it's amazing how many. Of these
although
car
Colt Mitsubishi Chrysler was a thing for sure.
Yeah, there've been international sort of scam job badge engineering stuff done for years. All the GM stuff was Daewoo for years. All the GM small stuff,
and then there was the Ford Mazda thing, and then I think the
Toyota Corolla with the Geo Prism.
Yes, Numi.
But
they were all American cars. Those were all American.
Not
cars.
necessarily. My 94 Corolla was built in Japan.
Yes,
this is a manual. Yeah, it's so fascinating but if you ever want to know why your car does what it does, go to that country, or not even that country, go to that part of the country where it was made.
Yes. That can be quite illuminating.
Pretty amazing. It shouldn't be a surprise, right? But go take a Honda S600, take my Beat and, try to drive that across Kansas. Honda reliability. Yeah. I don't know if it would survive.
You wouldn't survive
500 miles at 8,000 RPM. God, I'm sure it's a Honda. I'm sure it will survive, but still, it's miserable.
You won't.
Yeah, y'all wind up in the loony bin from just the noise.
Yeah.
Not morgue, but it would certainly drive you crazy. And you compare that to any 90s American car that's got a 3,800 cubic inch Buick V6 in it that's spinning at 3,800 cc, like the 3.8 liter Buick motor that's 1,200 RPM, just lugging along with push rods barely moving, getting 28 miles per gallon. Give it. GM engineered the shit out of that motor. They lasted forever.
I've never spent time with one.
Unremarkable in any other way other than its longevity and power and efficiency. You easily out of a 3.8 they only made really 200 horsepower, by the sort of heyday of
unless you got the supercharged Park Avenue Ultra,
right, which did burn
240 horsepower, and the Regal GS.
But they were relatively low stress motors that would last a tremendous amount of time by U.S. standards. 200,000 miles is not impossible from what I understand on those motors, which was not the case for like an Iron Duke or any of the generation
Quad 4.
But they lasted long, but they got great gas mileage. They were very efficient. They were, throttled down sort of torque monsters, not stressed, and they did their job for America.
Imagine that on the Autobahn.
Well, all I have to do is imagine my senior year of high school. Was it before or after I graduated? I think it was right at the summer I graduated high school. I came over with a German friend. We tried to rent a car. We couldn't. I think I've told the story before.
Yes. The Cavalier.
The Cavalier. We took my grandmother's 52,000 mile Chevy Cavalier, and it took a German 3 hours to explode the motor. There's been a bearing in it. And we're going up this hill, and there's no tack in the car because it's an American automatic, right? That would never really happen in Europe. And he's just, it was hunting between second and top gear, second and third. And he just got frustrated and left it in second and just matted it. Kept his foot on the floor up this hill. And it didn't, as it turns out, have a rev limiter. I don't know how fast it was going, but I don't think it was over 5,000 RPM. It wasn't much. But the thing spun a rod bearing. And GM, tore the motor apart. It was 3 weeks out of warranty. It was a 6 year, 60,000 mile warranty. And it was 52,000 miles in like 6 years and 2 weeks or something. Couple weeks. And so Chevy, we authorized a tear down, paid the dealership $100. They tore the engine down, saw no evidence of any neglect or abuse, and Chevy replaced the engine for my grandmother. But that's a 52,000 mile motor that survived 3 hours of a German on a U.S. road. Imagine, it would have made it 15 minutes on an Autobahn, and boom. They were not meant to survive what Germans do to cars.
But now there's globalization, there's universalization, and now for the most part, a car will survive that type of abuse, I think.
Well,
what American thing, where you take your minivan to Germany.
No.
They do sell them there.
And I'm sure it would be okay. But here's the thing, take a Tesla to Germany. because right now we have two American car cultures. We have the Silicon Valley car culture, which is, Rivian, R1T, obviously Tesla, Lucid, and then you have the traditionals. They are as different. No surprise, they're 2,500 miles away from each other, but they're as different as any two cars from Europe. And so the German motoring press was so slow to recognize any merits at all from Tesla, because they said these are not real cars. They can't do 250 kilometers an hour for their entire battery. Therefore, they're worthless. To which we're like, who does that? Like, it works.
We do.
But then you take Tesla Model X, even though it's an American car, and you bring it to Detroit, and the doors don't work because they get the stupid gull-wing doors get frozen, and they dump snow on people, and we don't have snow in the Bay Area. Mm-hmm. So even within the American car industry now, we have this, Tesla was the first. I'm certain that Lucid and Rivian have not made that same mistake. But at the end of the day, when your engineers are not driving those cars every day in those situations, there's going to be shortcomings.
Yeah, and this is why the Germans and whoever else would take their cars to Africa for hot weather testing, and then they'd go to Lapland for cold weather testing, and then they'd go to, wherever on Earth to.
And they all do that. I mean,
now.
Even the Lucids and the Teslas, they all do hot weather testing and cold weather testing, but it's weird
it's the day-to-day livability things.
Right. Wipers on Teslas just weren't good initially. It rains 3 months a year here, and then the rest of the time it's dry. But other weird things happen. BMWs in Marin County, for example, have a really big problem with flooding. And I talked to a German engineer about that, and together with one of the U.S. warranty guys. And he's like, nope, not an issue. And I'm like, your door panel seals. So BMWs have flow-through doors, as most cars now do. And so there's a vapor barrier in between the inside of the car and the inside of the door. Mm-hmm. So water flows down the window, through the door, and out the bottom, drain holes in the bottom. And in the Bay Area, we have a very strange combination of climates and geography. We have a lot of very big hills. And when it rains here, it rains, especially in Marin. We get huge rainfalls. 9 inches of rain overnight is not unusual.
That's unusual.
Once a year.
Yes.
Once a year we'll do that. But that's, last year, my producer was like, or my director was like, we had so much rain, like everything got flooded. They got 6.5 inches over 48 hours in New Jersey, and the whole place was underwater. I'm like, we got 11 last night, like in 6 hours. What are you talking about? Right. So when it rains here, it really rains. And then the rest of the time, a lot of these cars spend time under redwood trees and other trees that are dropping leaves and stuff. So the drains get clogged. And then we have 40-degree temperature fluctuations every day with no humidity, or depending on where you are, 100% humidity, 20% humidity, 120, 120. And so the butyl that holds, which is the sort of gloopy stuff that holds the vapor barriers onto the door, dries out, cracks, and separates. And so in the Bay Area, in Marin County specifically, every time we have the first rain of the year, there's a line of tow trucks at the BMW dealership around the block towing all these flooded cars in. Doesn't happen anywhere else, apparently.
Because of all the organic debris.
The debris, the grades, so the sunroof is draining backwards because the car is facing down a hill, and so all the water is going the wrong direction, and the cars flood. And BMW had the computers, and E39s and E46s were under the carpets. Well, that was fucking dumb. So the doors clog up, or the sunroofs clog up.
Volkswagen did that too.
Done.
With the locking modules.
Your car's
and then
now
you're locked out.
Yep. And it's just one of those things you would never guess that until you tested a car here or just lived with it for 5 years and stuff. So all of that stuff feeds back into these car companies, and when the companies are new or the products are new, they can't.
It's like driving in Canada with the cold snow intake instead of cold air intake.
I mean, the joke is that so many people in the Northeast and the Midwest vastly prefer halogen headlights because they melt the snow.
Generate warmth. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was talking to the retrofit source guys who do all those cool LEDs, and they came out with an LED that typical LEDs have a heatsink on the outside of the light fixture, and it wicks the heat away. They developed one that it blows the heat in through the lens assembly and then back out to warm it up, so you can use these in the winter. But this is the kind of stuff that, do you really think they would know in France? It doesn't get that cold. It's a Mediterranean climate,
unless you're in the Pyrenees or the Alps.
But no car companies are there.
That's true. That is true.
You get my point.
Yes, I have taken your point. I apologize for being excessively pedantic, but we have been around the world, so I'm a little bit tired.
You ate.
I also had lunch, so I'm more than a little bit tired. All right, this has been episode
Something.
number
Do
of
not
the
use the word.
Carmudgeon Show. We have been forbidden from using numbers any longer because it fucks everything.
Okay. So join us next week where there'll be another episode probably. We're
Unless
probably
it's
getting
the following week.
unless
It's like, the holidays
we're
right
getting
now.
there.
Who knows?
Let's take the rest of the year
Everybody
off.
might be drunk on eggnog or similar.
While I would like to take the rest of the year off, there's no way we can do that because this is too much fun.
And you have other... Okay. Fooling everyone.
I'm too tired.
Okay.
I had that whole sandwich.
Well, happy holidays and all that to all those who celebrate.
Stuff,
Happy Honda Days.
Whatever. Not Honda
And
Days.
Toyota-thon.
And December to remember.
How dare you wish me happy Honda Days when you know my family celebrates Toyota-thon.